So Ken had you do this thing called soft porn, which a lot of our users know about.
Well,
right?
soft porn was a big deal before I ever met Ken, or just about before I owned an Apple computer. Everybody I knew had a copy of soft porn. It was this text-only. In fact, it was the only text-only adventure game, or any kind of game, I guess, that Sierra ever did. It was the only game without graphics.
Right.
Because that was a big
And
deal
who was
for
the guy?
them back then. Chuck Benton wrote it because he was interested in creating database applications to run on the Apple II. And he thought, well, a good test case would be to create a database that read the data of an adventure game.
Right.
And so that was his test bed.
I remember,
and it ended up being a huge deal. It was one of the biggest selling games in the time. Now you got to understand, this was a time when Apple had shipped 100,000 Apple IIs,
and I think the statistic was that 25,000 copies of soft porn were out there on the market, right?
And everybody I knew had a pirated version. So I mean, I think Chuck achieved, I hate to say this, close to 100% penetration. Market penetration. But anyway, so Chuck wrote this game, and everybody I knew played it. It was huge. In fact, the first issue of Time magazine that ever had a column about home computers or personal computers, half of that article was about soft porn, the game. And it even featured the cover photo, which is famous because Roberta Williams and two other women are sitting naked in a hot tub.
Right, but you don't see anything.
Which was pretty hot for that. Well, they airbrushed on some bubbles.
Okay.
But,
wow.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a fun time. But the
do we have the source art to that?
Yeah. I know someone does, but I'm not going to say who. Berta, I'm sorry, Berta. Yeah. So soft porn was a big deal, but when we obtained the rights to the Disney characters, Disney wasn't so interested in having Mickey and Donald in the same catalog as soft porn. And by that time, the game had kind of run its course, and graphics were in, and text-only games were on their way out. And so Ken dropped soft porn, and we concentrated instead on other things. Well, after we gave up the Disney characters, then suddenly it was like, well, what can we do? What's a good thing to do? And we talked about how this had been a phenomenon back in those days. And so Ken said, why don't you see if we could bring that up to date? Use the modern 1987 3D interpreter, which we called it. AGI, it was called back then. And see what you can do. See if you can bring it up to date. And so I reported back to him a week later. I played the game, and I looked at it, and I said, God, Ken, this game is so out of touch. It should be wearing a leisure suit. And he laughed, and somebody else in the room laughed. I thought, maybe that's funny. Maybe leisure suits are funny. And I said the pressing thing, which was, I think the only way I could do this game is if you'd let me make fun of it. If I mocked this thing rather than taking it seriously, I think I could have some fun with this. I think we could make a good game. And he's at the time, you got to remember the company was very short of money, and they said, well, sure, let's do that then, but we're not going to give you any advances. How about just take a bigger royalty? And I said, well, sure, yeah, I guess if that's fair. I don't know, what did I wasn't. So we needed graphics for the game, and Mark Trowe was one of the few people on Earth who knew how to use our graphics tools.
Mark Trowe from Space Quest.
Well,
one of the two guys
later of Space Quest,
right.
but he had worked on a lot of games back then. He was a kid out of high school, went to high school in Fresno, and came up and got a job because he could understand the difference between drawing something on screen and saving it to a disk. A lot of the artists just assumed that as long as it was on their screen, it was safe, and so somebody would pull the plug or the program would crash and they'd lose everything. So, but Mark was hip early on to how computers actually worked, and so he did a great job. But he was working full time on Space Quest.
Space Quest 1.
Space Quest 1, which hadn't been released and was just, barely getting started. And so he said, well, I can't, you want me to take time away? No, we don't want you to give up any time from Space Quest. We got to have that. So they said, how about if we give you a big royalty if you work on Al's game in the evenings and weekends and work on Space Quest 40 hours a week during the day? And he said, okay. And it was the greatest thing that happened to either one of us because Sierra was in trouble and we helped him out, it ended up we got a big royalty. And, of course, it didn't look like a good idea immediately. When we first started, it was pretty scary because the game shipped in June of 1987 and was the worst-selling game in the history of the company. Once people found out about it, that it was a little risque and it was a little adult and was about a topic that hadn't been broached in games before, the salespeople didn't know how to sell it, the stores didn't know how to buy it, and it sold 4,000 copies at a time when most average games sold 50,000 copies out the door. So Mark and I kind of looked at each other and said, well, we screwed up 6 months of our lives. We wasted our time there. And but what happened was word of mouth spread on the game, and every month for months after month after month, the sales doubled. And it just became one of those wonderful curves, that does this.
So
after a year.
Hold on a second. Let's hold on now. So Leisure Larry 1 shipped, and it was a failure.
It was horrible.
What did he put you on after that?
Well, I didn't have any money coming in because remember I bet on the royalties and no advances, so I was broke. And so he said, "Well, Jim Walls needs help with Space Quest. Can you help with Police Quest? Can you go help Jim Walls?" And so I dove immediately out of Larry into
Police Quest 1.
Police Quest 1 with Jim Walls.
Okay, and salary position or another advance again?
No, advances that time and percentage and royalties.
Okay.
Yeah, so I worked for 6 months on that, and when I finally looked up, hey, Larry was starting to sell.
You were design on Police Quest or
no?
coding?
I was coder.
Okay.
I was the lead programmer, but I did help Jim with turning his story. Jim was a wonderful storyteller. But he wasn't so much on the puzzles then. I mean, it was his first game. He wasn't aware that, people wouldn't understand how to play the game unless you gave them some hints occasionally.
Right.
And so when I got to the project, it was like, well, how the hell would I know that?
Right.
You want me to type what? How would I know that?
I remember.
And so
Police
I
Quest.
went through
you had
and
to take the
mostly
baton and put it in the car door.
Oh, and you had all kind of all these
Procedures.
sequential procedures that
Right.
had to be followed. That's why they call them procedurals.
Right.
But so mostly what I did was say, "What? How would you know to do that?" And then I would add code that gave you hints and stuff.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, and then so did Police Quest ship, and then Larry started picking up, or?
Well, Larry just kind of did this. It was just strictly word of mouth, and if you remember your history, that fall in October, the stock market crashed, and there were lots of guys sitting around Wall Street that had nothing to do. And so somebody brought in a pirated version of Larry and installed it on their servers or something. So all these guys were sitting around Wall Street playing Leisure Suit Larry. But what they didn't know was that they had gotten a version from a bulletin board or someplace illegally that had a virus in it. And it was one of the first big computer viruses to hit business at the time. We had articles in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and so forth about these guys who had crashed their company's servers and stuff because they were playing Leisure Suit Larry. So that notoriety also helped it. So that it went through the fall and was growing, and then it went over Christmas, and then finally after a year. In fact, in the other room, I have a thing hanging on the wall from 1988. 13 months after the game shipped, it was in the top 10 of sales with a bullet.
Yeah, because it was a famous line.
It was a rising star.
You with that damn bullet.
I know, but it was so funny because now a game today,
I know,
it doesn't sell the first weekend.
I know.
Bargain bin.
I know.
It's
shelf life is 6 months now at the most.
Oh yeah,
I know.
And so that game really was just a word of mouth game. Now, I like to laugh. I mean, I said on the other video that we invented shareware. We just didn't know it because actually that game was pirated so much that we actually sold more hint books than we sold copies of the game. We sold hundreds of thousands of hint books for Larry because there was no internet. There was no place to go for help. And the puzzles were difficult if you weren't familiar with adventure games and how these things all work.
Right. That's really interesting.
It was fun.
I remember when because I started playing Infocom games, right, with the text adventures, and that's how I really, because I wasn't a big reader in school, and the Infocom games made me want to read.
But you have to read there.
Infocom, you mean
Yeah.
the games, exactly, and there was a lot of reading, right? And there was a lot of imagination. So when I started to play the Sierra games, like particularly King's Quest 1, I would type "Go North," and the parser came up and said, "Just go where you want to go,"
That's
and
right.
I said,
I
"Okay,
remember
go north." And I said, "No,
Yep.
go there," and I was like, "Okay, go there."
Well, it's funny though, because those games did have their own vocabulary and their own grammar, that you had to learn. I mean, it was difficult if you weren't familiar, or you had somebody who was a friend who could say, "Oh no, you do this, try this and that." Well, then once you kind of got into the lingo and to the way we did things, but yeah, it was a difficult time, much different than the times. Of course, you got to remember, games were tiny then.
Right.
I mean, that game, Larry 1 was too big to fit on one 360K floppy. Not 360 megs,
Right.
360K. So I had to put a little bit of the game on the second disc.
Yeah.
So I think
That
the
was
game in itself was probably...
single-sided 5.25-inch disc.
Yeah. So it's just amazing when you think about it. And Mark Trowe did all the graphics for that game in 1 month of time, while he was working full time on Space Quest.
So that leads me to another question that we were talking about earlier, which was what tools did he use to create the art?
Well, that's why Mark was so valuable, because Mark knew how to use the tools that Sierra had created
Photoshop.
in order to make the game. Yeah, Photoshop. Yeah, nobody understands this. There was no Photoshop. There was no animation tools. There was no sound edit. There wasn't sound compression. We invented our own sound compressing utility that made audio files 1/4 the size. And we were so proud. And then, MP3 files came out and they were 1/10 the size.
Right.
And it was like, oh, hell, let's just use this.
Right.
And when Photoshop came out, it was like, oh, my God, this is great. When we did those games, Mark, honest to God, in the early days, you did animation by drawing a cell on the screen with the mouse, clicking a few pixels here and there and changing colors and stuff.
Yep.
And then you could copy it and paste it next to it.
And just change.
And then you change what you thought it was, but there was no way to see the animation.
Right.
You couldn't go back and forth between the cells. You had to guess from this one to this one to that one. It was horrible.
Well, I mean,
the tools were just incredibly primitive.
I know. I mean, and the funny thing is it seems like yesterday, isn't it? I mean, because I remember working on Quest for Glory 4, and they had me doing lip syncing on Space Quest 6, and it was literally, they had Brightstar, which Sierra acquired, had this utility to do lip syncing, and it was literally this piece of paper and the software, and we were manually syncing the person's lips with the E's, O's, R, So I know the archaic.
That software was revolutionary at the time because it would look at the text file for that particular audio file, and it would do its best to line up the mouth positions with the text. It would look at the consonants and the vowels and things that were in the line of dialogue, and it would try to match, but it never did.
No,
it was always off.
I know.
And so somebody had to sit there and go, "Oh, drag this over.
Exactly.
I'll make the O here.
Yeah.
I'll make the T. Oh, there's the T. So I'll put that." Yeah,
And it's really funny. Nobody ever took my work, and so I don't even know if
never had time to. Who had time?